Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 8 Quentin Tarantino movies. This video is where I rank the movies of Quentin Tarantino from my least favorite to my favorite. I'm going to go ahead and call it 8 as Kill Bill was counted as 1 because technically it's 2 movies valued 1 and 2, so that would make Tarantino's total count be 9, but he also counts Kill Bill as 1 as he advertised the Hateful Eight as his 8th movie, so that's how I'll count them too. I'm also only considering films that Quentin Tarantino directed, not films that he starred in like From Dawn to Dusk, or films he produced like Hostel, or films he wrote like True Romance, or films he only directed part of like Four Rooms. Only his 8 official movies that he directed will be considered for this countdown. Originally, I had planned on doing a whole series of videos like this where I would count down the whole catalog of my favorite directors' films from worst to best, but it came to the point where I had far too many videos planned. It was really daunting as I doubted I'd ever get through them all, so I scrapped a lot of ideas I had like this one. But recently I watched all of Quentin Tarantino's films in preparation for the Hateful Eight release, so I decided to make an exception for Quentin Tarantino, who is an exceptional director, and go ahead and make a video about how I feel about his 8 movies since they're all still fresh in my head. So I'll start with my number 8 and thus least favorite Quentin Tarantino movie, which is very easily Death Proof. To be honest, after I saw this movie, I nearly gave up on Tarantino and wrote him off. This movie was so subpar, especially when compared to his other films. Now, this movie has 2 halves, really. At the first half, we meet a group of 4 young women who are friends. In the second half, we meet a totally different group of 4 young women that are friends. The connecting link being that they are both terrorized by a psycho who likes to kill people with his stunt car named Stuntman Mike. Now, the first half of the movie I thought was just awful. None of the characters were believable. Typically, I love Tarantino dialogue, but here it just fell flat. There were a lot of lines and parts that were just pointless and served no purpose. And the girls' dialogue felt like it was too obviously written by a man, so it was more like what men think girls say rather than what they actually say. So once I got through the first half, I decided the movie was absolutely terrible. However, when we got to the second half, it wasn't quite as bad. The characters were much more believable. I totally bought them. Plus, their stories seemed to serve a point, unlike the first half of the film, where meeting those 4 characters felt entirely pointless. And the part with the girls going up against Stuntman Mike was really tense and entertaining. It felt like the subpar first half was completely unnecessary, other than introducing the audience to Stuntman Mike, but that was an extremely long-winded way to introduce a character. The ending of the film wasn't realistic at all, but it was entertaining and highly stylized, and only the way Tarantino can do. So my rating out of 10 for Death Proof is a 4 poor. Next we get to my number 7, Jackie Brown. Now, Jackie Brown was a fine movie. It was alright, certainly better than a lot of other movies being made, but when compared to Tarantino's other films and the precedent he set, it's kind of subpar. This is where I think his style kind of failed him a bit, as this is the only film where his slow pacing and drawn out dialogue scenes actually felt kind of boring and seemed to drag on for too long. Plus, the film's story, while being good and really well executed, was kind of flat and simplistic when compared to the complexity and highly stylized storytelling of his other films. So, in other words, I was entertained. Samuel L. Jackson gave an amazing performance. The chemistry between Pam Grier and Robert Forster worked really well, but I really feel this film would have benefited from being at least a half an hour shorter, and unlike Tarantino's other works, it's ultimately nothing special. So my rating for Jackie Brown is a 6 good. So next we'll get to my number 6, and that's Inglourious Basterds. Now, Inglourious Basterds is one of those movies that is really well liked, and I thought it was a really excellent movie and would put it above almost all modern day movies, but because of the fact I feel this movie gets a bit more praise than it deserves, I more often than not are more inclined to point out the film's flaws, which I feel go overlooked far too often, which gives people a false impression that I didn't like the movie, when in fact I love this film. But I've seen so many critics recently rank this as Tarantino's best film. Is it a great film? Absolutely. Is it Tarantino's best? Not by a long shot. There are many things to admire about this film. Many great scenes, such as the opening scene with the Nazi is looking for the hidden French Jews, or the scene in the bar where the three Allied agents posing as Germans are at risk of being discovered. Tarantino redefined suspense in those scenes and kept you on the edge of your seat more than any other film had ever done before. And Christoph Waltz was amazing in this film. He was great at playing a really interesting and menacing villain, probably one of the best villains ever to appear on film. But unlike Tarantino's other films that didn't really have a cohesive story and felt more like a string of awesome scenes thrown together that didn't really flow very well. And plus, I just get the sense after watching this film that I was missing something, almost like I watched an incomplete film, or there was some inside joke that I just didn't get. It just didn't feel like it fully fleshed out as it could have been. And plus, the ending that altered history, many critics seem to state this as a positive, where I see it as a negative, because it's just too over the top. It kind of undermines some of the seriousness of the scenes in the film that were really great. It reminded me too much like the movie Pearl Harbor, that had to show the Americans kicking ass, even if that's not what really happened. But don't get me wrong, I love this movie and there were things about it that were truly exceptional, but it wasn't flawless like some of his other films were, so I wouldn't call it his best by a long shot. So my rating for Inglourious Basterds is an 8, extremely good. So, next is my number 5, which is Kill Bill. Now, to be honest, I had a really tough time deciding which film should be higher, this or Inglourious Basterds, as it was a really close call. But in the end, I gave the slight edge to Kill Bill. To be honest, if I were to split this into the two volumes, Volume 1 would be behind Inglourious Basterds and Volume 2 would be ahead of it. But counting it as one, it only had a slight edge over it. Honestly, I felt this would have been better had it been one film. Volume 1 was visually stunning, had a lot of amazing scenes that were just beautiful to watch, and the whole style of it was just badass. But in terms of story, it wasn't really necessary. It could have very easily been streamlined and condensed into one 3-hour movie. I think split it in two really hampered it, as it put the emphasis on Lucy Liu's character, who in the end was nothing more than a minion. The real meat of the story came in Volume 2 when we explored more of Bill, who after all is the title character. So I felt the focus should have been on him all along. But when they did get to it, it was amazing storytelling. In fact, I go as far to say this is Tarantino's most emotionally powerful film. As most of his films tend to have a sterile sense of black humor that I love and think works really well, but seldom do you see Tarantino wander into the realm of melodrama, but when he did it here, it worked amazingly well. There were such chilling scenes at the end when the bride finally confronts Bill. And it was also a cool way to subvert expectations, as the whole other movie and the first half movie was all bloody action, and to have it end on an emotionally conversation with only 20 seconds of action was a bold decision, and personally I think it paid off in spades. Plus, as I said, both films were incredibly visually stunning throughout. So my rating for Kill Bill is an 8, extremely good. Number 4 is Django Unchained. So to me, Tarantino kind of dipped in quality after Pulp Fiction. Kill Bill was good, but not as good as the first two. And when Death Proof came out, well, I started to think Tarantino's first two films were a fluke, and he just couldn't really make a good movie again. But then Inglourious Basterds came out, which reassured me he still had it. But this film showed me he could be truly great again. I felt it built off of what he did in Inglourious Basterds by having a thick layer of suspense and uneasiness just under the surface, where above the surface seemed like normal nonsense conversation, but it took it to a whole new level in this film. The entire half of the film, once Django and Dr. Schultz go undercover as main dingo sellers, was just so intense. There was a constant layer of suspense that made one really uneasy, and part of the reason this was pulled off so well was because of Leonardo DiCaprio's amazing performance in this film, which personally I think was one of his best performances in his entire career. But if that wasn't enough to make this film great, the characters of Django and Dr. Schultz were really interesting, and the first part of the film where they meet and partner up was really engaging. Tarantino took his ability to create really rich and unique characters and applied it to a more traditional narrative rather than playing with narrative structure as he usually does, and it worked out beautifully. The ending was a bit silly and over the top, and one might complain that it was just as bad, if not worse, than Inglourious Basterds in terms of the hero winning the day in a manner that isn't entirely historically accurate. While what happens at the end of this film would be really unlikely to happen in real life during that time period, it doesn't completely rewrite history like Inglourious Basterds did, so for me it's not as bad. This was a near perfect movie, but it did have its flaws here and there, so my rating for Django Unchained is a 9 excellent. So next we get to my number 3, and first of all I have to say that I had a really hard time choosing between these 3, which I feel are easily Tarantino's best films, and I kept going back and forth of which order to put these 3 movies in, and finally I came up with this, but it was very close. So I'll start with my number 3, which is The Hateful Eight. If I named Inglourious Basterds Tarantino's most overrated film, I would also name The Hateful Eight as Tarantino's most underrated film. I was solely disappointed with the critical reaction to this film, which, although was mostly positive, I think it severely understated how great this film was. I saw this film a second time thinking that maybe I was just blown away by it the first time and it wouldn't hold up as well on repeated viewings, but that wasn't the case at all. If anything, I liked this film even more after seeing it for a second time. So I can very comfortably say that I feel this was clearly Tarantino's best movie since his first 2 movies in the 90s, as I feel he finally truly recaptured the style of his 90s films that made him truly unique. I also couldn't possibly disagree more with the common complaint that one of these sequences in the film was unnecessary. I feel those that see it that way are looking at this film like a traditional Hollywood narrative and not a Tarantino film where he does what he does best by playing with the narrative structure and chronological order, and I think this is one of the best examples of that. I also disagree with those that say the film was too long. Although it was slow paced, I didn't think it was too long at all. In fact, when it was over, I looked at my watch and saw that 3 hours had passed, and I was shocked. I thought it was only like an hour and a half. The time just flew, and I couldn't, I could have actually sat and watched another couple hours of that film. I also feel that the ending of this film is one of the best examples of this particular style of ending that only Tarantino can pull off, as many other directors try, and I feel they fail miserably. Also, in my opinion, the performance Samuel L. Jackson gives in this film is the performance of his career and one of the best performances in any film ever, and it's an absolute travesty that he wasn't even nominated for an Oscar. It's up there with debacles like Jake Gyllenhaal not being nominated for Nightcrawler. I've also seen a lot of critics comparing this movie to Clue or a typical murder mystery, and personally I think if you're looking at it that way, you're kind of missing the point. While it certainly has that element of a murder mystery, it's so much more than that, and perhaps that's why I didn't think it was too long. So my rating for The Hateful Eight is a 10, the best. Number 2 is Pulp Fiction. the classic Pulp Fiction. I saw this in theaters in 1994 when it first came out, and I remember being completely blown away by this film. It was one of those films that I had to think about for days, even weeks, because it was just absolutely like nothing I have ever seen before. I remember the first time I saw this, I was looking at it from the perspective of a typical Hollywood film, so I was totally taken aback by things happening outside of chronological order. And then when John Travolta's character, who I thought was the main character, died about 2/3 of the way through the movie, I remember thinking, well, they can't do that, he's the main character. But after months of contemplation, I came to appreciate it as a truly unique work of art. There was nothing that came before this film that was anything like it, and even though many imitators tried, there was nothing that came after this film that was quite like it either. This movie is a pure masterpiece in my mind, as it redefined what it's like to watch film. The characters were all extremely rich and the dialogue was amazing. Tarantino is consistently good on these points, but here he captures it so well, with so many memorable moments and an overall story that seems chaotic on the surface but actually works really well and is a testament to Tarantino's knowing his craft. So my rating for Pulp Fiction is a 10, the best. And my number one favorite Quentin Tarantino movie is Reservoir Dogs. His first, and to me, still his best film. Many may not think it's his best because it's more stripped back, it's more simple, and done on a smaller budget than his other films. But that is one of the main reasons why I love it so much, because here you get to see Tarantino doing what he does best at his basics, that is non-linear storytelling, and that's mostly dialogue and performance driven. I've always been a huge fan of films that just consist of mostly dialogue and take place mostly on one location, and Tarantino is the master of dialogue, and I feel he pulls off the best here, because they had a smaller budget and couldn't have fancy locations or fancy equipment to have fancy cinematography or fancy action sequences and all that. They had to improvise and work with what they had, and the result ultimately is emphasizing the performances. In fact, watching this film, sometimes it feels like a stage play, and I find that a really great thing, as you get amazing performances from like Harvey Keitel, Steve Buscemi, Tim Roth, and Michael Madsen, who are all absolutely shine in this film. But you do get some amazing pieces of cinema that highlight why it needed to be a film rather than a stage play, such as the amazing scene where Tim Roth's Mr. Orange tells the story about how cops almost busted him when he was in a public restroom. Just the way that was shot with the circular motions and the stylized editing choices was simply amazing. Everything about this movie from start to finish just worked so well and was so unique. I still feel that his first was his best, making Reservoir Dogs my number one favorite Quentin Tarantino movie. So that's it for my top 8 Quentin Tarantino movies. Be sure to check out my channel for other videos such as my top 50 movie series and my Breaking Convention film series, where I give unpopular opinions on films, and I also do a lot of videos on shows like Game of Thrones and Star Trek, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that, and thanks a lot for watching.